So again, just some basic language, basic vocabulary, and some basic types of arguments that you'll see. Sometimes the authors of your articles that you've been assigned being used, or if you're using Classic Questions as the textbook for the class, you'll see the author using these basic argument forms in the commentary or the discussion of various philosophical positions. Arguments fail, as we've already kind of indicated, if they're either weak or invalid, or if they have a false premise. So we already know some errors of reasoning to avoid. Another type of error in reasoning to avoid is a fallacy. In fact, we've already looked at two formal fallacies very briefly. Now we'll look at informal fallacies. So a formal fallacy, that only occurs in deductive reasoning, where we're worried about the structure, the form of the argument. So they got to have correct form, a valid form. Informal fallacies have to do with the content of the language, what philosophers call the propositional content of the statements, not just the underlying structure of them. And so these are errors in reasoning based on ambiguity in language, or the meaning of terms, or maybe types of weak induction is another type of informal fallacy. There's these things called fallacies of relevance, where the language that's used or the reasons that are given are not, the content of them is not relevant to the conclusion, right, or the truth of the conclusion. And so here we got to worry about looking at the language, the actual content of the arguments, rather than just the structure of them, like we were doing with the two formal fallacies that we briefly mentioned in the deductive reasoning section. So again, we have this definition of an argument, group of propositions, at least one of which is said to support the truth of the conclusion. A fallacy then is an error in reasoning, but since there are different types of error in reasoning, we need to specify what a fallacy is. It's an error in reasoning such that even if the premises are true, they don't logically imply the truth of the conclusion. That's really what a fallacy is. So it doesn't really mean just a false statement. It means an argument such that even if the premises are true, they don't logically imply the truth of the conclusion. So I say here that our arguments can fail in three basic ways, right? There are more ways, but these are the three basic ways. One, they might have a factual error, an argument that contains a premise that is disproven by science or empirical verification. So if I have the argument, if the moon is made of blue cheese, then I can consume the moon, I can eat the moon. The moon is made of blue cheese, therefore I can eat the moon. Very simple modus ponens argument, in fact. So it has a valid form. But that's an argument in which the second premise, the moon is made of blue cheese, is false. And we know that because we've sent people to the moon. It's made of rock, not blue cheese. Factual error is something that we know on the basis of observation of the world, or the use of this, a result of the scientific method that's been confirmed. Another way in which arguments can fail is they might contain a logical contradiction, which is called a self-defeating or self-refuting or self-contradictory argument. We'll talk about that idea, which is going to be very important for us in this class in the second lecture on critical thinking that's on the article from Johnson, and covers that material. So that we'll look at that a little bit later. What we're going to look at in the last part of this presentation or lecture is the notion of a fallacy. So this is another kind of logical error. A logical contradiction is obviously a logical error as well, but a fallacy is a logical error, and you need to match that idea of a fallacy up with both the idea of deductive invalidity and an inductively weak argument. Right? So an invalid argument is formally fallacious. An inductively weak argument is also inductively weak. It means even if the premises are true, it's likely that the conclusion could still be false. Right? And deductive, even if the premises are true, the conclusion could still be false. That's our notion of invalid argument. So these are logical errors, again, such that even if the premises are true, they don't logically imply the truth of the conclusion, either because of invalidity or because of weakness. Right? And again, what we're worried about here are errors in reasoning based on the content, not just the underlying structure of the argument. So one of the best ways to get our heads around this idea of rational persuasion or logical persuasion versus emotional or merely rhetorical persuasion is by thinking about an appeal to emotion. This is a fallacy that's not covered in the ARP article. It is a very common fallacy, so I've included it here. And I've got a pop culture example of it. So let's watch this first. I'm going to play it here off the internet, and hopefully this will work as a way of showing it to you. The example here comes from a clip of the Daily Show back when Jon Stewart was the host of it. So many years ago for most of y'all.
Many people don't know that prior to joining our staff, Steve Carell was one of Madison Avenue's top advertising executives. He uses this experience as well as his experience as a pioneering, let's say, astronaut in a segment we call Ad Nauseam. When it comes to advertising, an emotional appeal will always be more successful than an appeal to the intellect. Emotions are powerful, and even better, they're easy to manipulate. Nowhere is this more evident than in ads dealing with health and well-being.
We're Pfizer. We're working to create a world where there will be a cure for your father's Alzheimer's.
My father?
Your sister's heart condition.
My sister has a heart condition?
Your best friend's diabetes.
Jesus Christ, Freddie!
The new Pfizer is poised to do more for human health than any other pharmaceutical company in history.
Okay, I say. For a minute there, I thought everyone I love was dying. But it turns out Pfizer was just trying to scare me into thinking everyone I love was dying. Got me. You see, advertisers know that the threat of a horrifically painful disease that ravages both body and mind and leaves you helpless and forsaken, wallowing in your own bodily excretions and begging for the sweet relief of merciful death can be quite an attention getter.
Sister's heart condition, diabetes, cancer, AIDS, Pfizer.
I'm sold. But instilling fear in the consumer isn't only useful in selling drugs that save lives. It also works for more important things.
Will she feel the same way if you lose your hair?
Sure. She'll just feel it about somebody else.
Don't worry, I love you.
Well, we'll see how long that lasts. After all, science has shown that bald guys are pathetic losers who can't hold on to their women. Just look at this guy with the imperceptibly receding hairline and unnoticeable thinning. It's a miracle she's still in the same room with him.
Anyway, you don't have to lose it.
Are you talking about Rogaine?
Rogaine. Maybe. Why not?
Yeah, why not? You'll save your shallow relationship and a lot of embarrassment. Take it from me. John.
Thank you, Steve. We'll be right back.
All right, let's get back to the definition of appeal to emotion here. Make that bigger. I did that the wrong way there. There we go. So appeal to emotion. This is one of our informal fallacies. And again, this one in particular helps us get across this idea or this distinction between rhetorical or merely rhetorical persuasion, persuasion through non-rational means, versus rational persuasion or logical persuasion. So the appeal to emotion fallacy occurs when an arguer attempts to support a conclusion by appealing to or manipulating the audience's emotions rather than by presenting impartial reasons and evidence to support a conclusion. Common versions of this include the appeal to pity, appeal to fear, and there are a couple other versions as well. We saw the fear version in the example from the Daily Show there, appeal to maybe personal vanity there as well. Fear of losing your relationship, your romantic relationship or significant other, right? And so in logic and in philosophy, what we're worried about is we're worried about reasons that are impartial, right? Or logical, person neutral, impartial or objective reasons, even if they're not empirical reasons. that are publicly accessible, right, and can be publicly evaluated, right? In other words, they don't just depend on what's on the inside of my head or how I feel about something. That would be stuff that's subjective, person specific, or people specific, right? Even if it was a collection of people that had a particular feeling, that wouldn't make their conclusion true, right? So the appeal to emotion can occur in different ways. Here's one of the main ways that it occurs is this appeal to pity, right? There's a Latin name for it, but we're not going to worry about the Latin name. It's argument ad miscordium. Many of these have Latin names because they were codified way back when, or identified and cataloged by scholars that used Latin. So appeal to, here's an example then of a fallacious appeal to pity argument. Professor, I know that I have not had the best attendance in class and I've done horrible on almost all the assignments, but if I get another D, then I will lose my scholarship and have to move back home with my parents. Surely you don't want me to suffer that and move back home. It would be humiliating for me. So you can see your way fit to get me a C. So the conclusion that they're offering is that you ought to give me a C. And the reason for that, that they're giving as the reason, right, is the justification there, is because it would be horrible for the student, right? You don't want the student to feel horrible, so you should give them a better grade. So appeal to emotion. The name of these fallacies indicates what's fallacious about the inference, right? So again, fallacy, even if those are true, that you'd have to move back home, you would feel horrible, and you'd lose your scholarship, those are all emotional ploys, right? They might all be true in the sense that it might be a matter of fact that you will lose your scholarship and have to move back home. But the mere feeling, you don't want to feel bad. I mean, you don't want me to feel bad isn't a good reason for, or a relevant reason for assigning grades. After all, grades are supposed to be assigned on the basis of what you accomplished, not that something unfortunate is going to happen to you because you got a bad one. So appeal to emotion. Next fallacy up, argument ad hominem. So this one is discussed in the Chewbacca defense and in most readings that I assign on fallacies. If you were assigned classic questions in contemporary film, the appeal to emotion or appeal to pity is in there. It's just not in the art article that I've assigned in other classes, or maybe only assigned that article. But I am including it here. Right, so argument against the person or ad hominem attack. There are many versions of this as well. One of the main ones is ad hominem abusive. And this fallacy occurs when involves two arguers, and it occurs when one of them advances directly or indirectly an argument and the other arguer responds by attacking some aspect of the arguer's person or character rather than the argument they advanced. Against the person, right? It tells you what's going on in the argument. So instead of attacking the evidence and the reasons that are a part of the argument, I am attacking the person that gave the argument and then saying that that's a reason for us to reject the conclusion as true, right? As objectively true. Likewise, if I were saying really good things about the person that was giving the argument, that wouldn't make the conclusion true, right? So you need to think about these things in that way. And start thinking about, well, just because something is that I don't like about that arguer doesn't mean that their argument is bad or their conclusion is false. And just because something about the arguer that I like, maybe it's my dad or my wife, that doesn't make their conclusion true either, right? Fallacies of relevance there. Even if the premises are true, they don't necessarily or even probably imply that they're not connected in any logical way to the truth of the conclusion. So here's an example of an ad hominem abusive. And I'll usually just in class talk about this. It's just ad hominem. It's one of the most basic versions of it. Usually the first version that people learn. So we have here, here's the argument. Mr. Smith argues that we should legalize marijuana for both personal liberty and economic reasons, but Smith is just a dope smoking hippie that wants to spend his time getting high rather than being a productive member of society. So obviously the notion we should legalize marijuana is ridiculous. So the reason given for rejecting the truth of the conclusion is not a problem with either the personal liberty argument or a problem with the economic reasons argument, get more tax money out of it or something. It's something about the arguer themselves, right? So it's attacking the person rather than the argument. That's ad hominem. And this one, my example is the ad hominem abusive. As I list here, there are different versions of this as well. Guilty by association, ad hominem circumstantial, poisoning the well. So in many cases, we have a basic idea and then a couple of varieties of this. And we'll see this is true later on with false cause fallacy later in the semester as well. Next up, then we have straw man fallacy. This fallacy occurs when I take a position, I distort it, make it look weak and ridiculous, beat up on the weak or distorted version. Usually it's so distorted that people that actually advocate for that conclusion wouldn't accept that argument as a characterization of their position or their argument. Then I beat up on that distorted straw man, right? And then act like I've defeated the position. So here's an example of this. Mr. Goldberg has argued against prayer in public schools. Obviously, Mr. Goldberg is advocating atheism. So something that's unpopular, right? But atheism is what they have in Russia. It leads to the suppression of all religions and the replacement of God by an omnipotent state. Is that what we want for this country? I hardly think so. So therefore, Mr. Goldberg's argument is nonsense, right? So making the argument look weak or ridiculous, easier to attack, beating up on that version of the argument, and then pretending like I've defeated the reason for accepting or rejecting the position that was offered. Here's a red herring. So you look, just going back to straw man fallacy, you see that in political debates on cable news all the time, where they're distorting the position, making it look ridiculous. Therefore, we should reject that view. Red herring is another fallacy, and it occurs when an arguer distracts the audience's attention by changing or shifting subjects, then draws a conclusion about the second subject, or merely implies or presents an innuendo that a conclusion about it has been established. So it's a diversionary tactic. Red herring is throwing us off the trail. So it may be subtly related, but it is a shift in subject or topic. So I know I earned a B+. Here's my example. I know I earned a B+ average based on how I did on all the graded work, but I put a lot of effort into studying for this class. I'm not saying the B+ is a bad grade, but it doesn't reflect just how much work and effort I put into the class over the semester, so I deserve an A. So you ought to give me an A. But of course, here's the shift in subject, right? Grades are supposed to be based on your actual achievement, right? It's not a measure, it's a measure of what you actually did in terms of achievement, not the effort that you went into trying to make that achievement, right? So a shift in topic there. In South Park, we see a blatant example of this. In fact, it's the fact that it's such a radical shift in topic, in subject matter, that drives the humor of the situation. The Chewbacca defense itself, right? So where Chewbacca lives is irrelevant to the truth of the conclusion at hand, the topic at hand, namely whether Chef wrote the song or not. So you can look that clip up if you want to watch it, or I posted the link to it on Moodle as well. Next, we have appeal to false or inappropriate or unqualified authority, irrelevant authority, right, for the subject matter of the argument. So arguments from expertise are important. We claim to know a lot of what we know on the basis of the testimony or the consensus, some kind of expert consensus. But they need to be an expert in the relevant area for the argument. So an appeal to false or unqualified authority occurs when or a fallacious appeal to authority occurs when the arguer appeals to or cites an authority figure's claims as justification for the truth of some conclusion, but they're an authority figure. They may be an authority figure, but not in the relevant or right way. So here's my example, and this will drive home the point of what I mean by the right kind of expert for the subject matter. So the preacher at my church says evolution is junk science. He's a very smart man with a PhD in theology, so evolution must really be pseudoscience. Well, his expertise is in theology, not in biology, right? So just on the basis of his authority in an irrelevant area of expertise, we can't conclude that what he's claiming is true about this other area. So it's like this is like the philosophical or logical version of the "my daddy says" argument. Well, if daddy's not an expert in the subject matter of the content of that argument, then it doesn't matter that he's an authority figure to you, your daddy, right? In other words, that he's an authority to you in a particular way, the father, right, doesn't mean that what he's saying is true about this other topic. So, well, you get the idea, right? If we're worried about, to use a contemporary example, if we're worried about whether or not coronavirus is transmittable in certain ways, we need to appeal to the authority of epidemiologists and doctors, right? Medical scientists that study that sort of thing. I wouldn't say, well, my niece, who is a nurse, says X about coronavirus's transmittability or communicability. Just because she's a nurse doesn't mean might mean she knows something, but not as much as the epidemiologist, right? So hasty generalization. We looked at an inductive generalization earlier. That's just a type of inductive argument. When inductive generalizations are weak, it's the same thing as a hasty generalization fallacy. Okay? Meaning that, again, even if the premises are true, they're insufficient for proving the truth of the conclusion, even with a high degree of probability. So a hasty generalization occurs when we draw a general conclusion about an entire group based on an unrepresentative sample, right? Another way in which hasty generalizations work is like stereotyping on the basis of an irrepresentative sample. So recall that in inductive generalization arguments, it requires a representative sample of the group. So that's where you get into the statistics of sampling and all that sort of thing. So here's my example of a hasty generalization argument. Or a weak inductive generalization. I've met 5 New Yorkers and they were all rude. Therefore, it's probably true that all New Yorkers are rude. Well, all New Yorkers, there's millions of people in New York City, and the 5 that I happen to come across isn't a representative sample of all of those. So here in this version, we also have an anecdotal problem because it's just the ones that I know. So it's not a representative sample of, statistically speaking, of all of the numbers of people. It's an insufficient sample. Next, we have slippery slope. So this fallacy occurs when an arguer claims that X will cause Y, where there's a long causal chain of intermediary events that's said to lead down the hill, down the slope, to some bad outcome, right? But where there's not enough evidence to suggest, even with a matter of probability or a matter of necessity, that X will in fact initiate that long causal chain of events that will lead down to Y. So many versions of this fallacy occur when it's argued that we shouldn't take some initial, presumably innocuous or innocent step because doing so will lead all the way down to disaster. Since it will lead to disaster, we can't take that initial step. So here's my example of a slippery slope fallacy argument. Immediate steps should be taken to outlaw birth control. If people have continued access to birth control, it will surely lead to an increase in promiscuity, which in turn will cause an increase in divorces, right? Because people don't like it when you're unfaithful to them. The increase in divorces will ultimately erode the moral fabric of our culture and cause the collapse of society, right? So birth control, collapse of society, where there's a long causal chain of events where taking that initial step, having access to birth control, where there's not enough evidence to suggest that that will lead to increases in promiscuity and then increases in divorce and then the erosion of our moral fabric and then the collapse of society. So, you know, it's like the argument that says if you if you try one drug, then the next thing you know, you're going to be selling yourself for heroin money or something like that, right? So there's a commercial with a humorous version of this as well. It's a DirecTV commercial. So you can look the commercial up on YouTube if you want. I have the dialogue of it here, and it runs as follows. When your cable company keeps you on hold, you get angry. When you get angry, you blow off steam. When you blow off steam, accidents happen. When accidents happen, you get an eye patch. When you get an eye patch, people think you're tough. When people think you're tough, they want to see how tough. And when people want to see how tough, you wake up on a roadside ditch. Don't wake up in a roadside ditch. Get rid of cable and upgrade to DirecTV. So here I have reconstructed version of that is a big hypothetical, what's called a hypothetical syllogism argument that consists of a long chain of if-then statements. But again, it's a slippery slope example, meaning that the content of this argument is such that there's a weak connection between the if-then, all of the if-thens, such that if we keep cable or we don't get direct TV, that it's going to lead down the road to me getting beaten up and tossed into a roadside ditch. So that's an example of what's called a fallacy of weak induction. There's another scene from The Daily Show you can look up where Stewart accuses his guest, in this case Bill Bennett, of making a slippery slope argument. He uses that language explicitly. All right, next we have false dichotomy. Also, other names for this one include false dilemma, false bifurcation. Many times it's just called the either-or fallacy. Right? And it's committed when an arguer or an argument presents two alternatives as if they exhaust all the logical possibilities, when in fact there's at least a third option that, or another option rather, I should say, that is left out. So sometimes we get, I just did it there, I got tripped up on the idea that it's two options. Well, it could be three options, but if a fourth that are presented as if they exhaust all the logical possibilities, but if it really just obscured or left out a fourth possibility, we'd still have a false dichotomy there. So again, it's when the options that are presented as if they exhaust all the logical possibilities, when in fact they don't. They leave out some possible logical alternative. So I got a couple of options here, or examples here. Either morality is based on religion or anything goes. So in Rick and Morty, sometimes it's presented as if, if God doesn't exist, then everything is meaningless, and there is no really any morality. You should just do what you want. So either morality is based on religion or anything goes. You reject religion, so there's the denial of one of those options. Thus, you must believe that anything goes. Here's another example of a false dichotomy argument. You either agree with the president's policies on terrorism or you support terrorism. You disagree with the president's policies, thus you support terrorists. So in each of these versions, it looks like a valid disjunctive syllogism argument, but because of the language that's used, it's obscuring or excluding an alternative. So in this case, we would say that the dichotomy is false. It's got a false premise in there because of an informal, because of an informal fallacy based on the content that's offered. So in both of these versions here, the either-or premise in both of these arguments leaves out a third logical possibility. In the first example, it's the possibility of being non-religious and committed to some moral viewpoint. We'll study many of those later in the semester. And in the second options, it's that it's logically possible for you to both disagree with the president's policies on terrorism and not be a terrorist supporter, right? And to disagree with terrorism. So those are the options that's left out. So, sometimes people get tripped up when they're learning this. They think, oh, well, it's got an either or, that means it's a false dichotomy. Well, just because it's got an either or premise doesn't mean it's a false either or premise. You always got to, in order to show it's false, you got to identify the logical possible option. And then if you can do that, then it's a false premise. But some dichotomies really are true either ors, either logically speaking or pragmatically speaking in terms of practical reasoning. All right, so detecting these fallacies, you got to have a solid grasp of the fallacies themselves, informal fallacies and their basic ideas. You need to be attentive to what the reasoning is, right? And think about how to boil the argument down to its basic inference or inferences. That means having a clear grasp of what the speaker is trying to convey. If it's not clear, you might have to run through the different interpretations that are possible and see if those are fallacious, if any. And then you need to be able to distinguish between inferential passages, arguments, and non-arguments, non-inferential passages. So it's important to point out that in order to have a fallacy present, it has to be an argument. Right? In order to have an argument, you got to have at least one premise and a conclusion and an alleged connection between them. If you don't have an argument, you can't have a fallacy. So fallacies are committed for a variety of reasons. We might be careless, right? We might not know the right information. Sometimes they are committed by accident, but if they're committed by accident or intentionally, they're still fallacious. Some person might be using fallacies intentionally to try to manipulate someone, right? Or we might just have a careless or lazy or a tired mental attitude, right? Try to avoid all of those problems when we're trying to sort out the truth of these philosophical positions, right? So here's an example of a question, right? And I'm going to use this to drive home that point that a fallacy is an error in reasoning or an error in argumentation. So you got to have an argument there. And again, we got a technical definition of an argument to worry about. So what informal fallacy, if any, is committed in the following passage? And the passage is John Smith is a jerk. Usually I do this in class, and I'll ask the class, how many people think that this is a fallacious argument? Nearly every time I've done this, and I've done this for years, lots and lots of hands, a majority of hands go up and they say, that's an ad hominem. Called him a jerk. But it's not an ad hominem, right? It is only one sentence. And in order to have an argument, you got to have at least two statements. You got to have a premise and a conclusion, right? So not just two statements, but two statements such that one, the truth of one of them, the premise, is said to support the truth of the other, the conclusion. So in other words, you got to have premises and conclusions there, right? That's just one statement. So contrast John Smith is a jerk with John Smith is a jerk, therefore his view about taxation is false. There I've committed an ad hominem fallacy because I'm giving the fact that I think he is a jerk as the reason for rejecting the truth of a conclusion that he's offered. Right, so that's ad hominem abusive. One sentence by itself does not make an argument. In order to have a fallacy, you got to have an argument there. So again, that definition of an argument, that definition of a fallacy is very important. All right, so that wraps up the material for this little brief part of the logic lesson. If you want some practice identifying fallacies, you could maybe watch a movie called Thank You for Smoking, which is excellent practice for that. There are many fallacies in there, many of which we didn't cover, but it contains a lot of them, including ones that we did cover. You can also look at the worksheet that's posted on Moodle that's a fallacy practice there. So that'll give you some extra practice identifying these if you need some of that. There are hundreds and hundreds of informal fallacies. If you go to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and look at the fallacy section, they've got a whole long list, and that's probably not even all of them. So we'll just work with these basic ones for now, and we're going to add to this a little bit later in the semester, especially when we get to the philosophy of religion section. There's a whole article devoted to another fallacy called false cause there. But this will wrap it up for this portion of the lesson. If you have questions about anything out of the assigned reading on basic logic, either the forms or types of arguments or the informal fallacies, feel free to ask those in the discussion forum or to ask them when we have a live Q&A session. So with that, we'll pause here, and you might want to review the material that we've covered so far. Second half of the lesson for logic here is on the law of non-contradiction. So that's the one you should look at next. All right, until then, I'll see y'all later.